Are you one of those people who says, oh, I bet this team's going to win? Oh, yeah, you think that team's going to win? I bet they don't. Well, actually, at esports pools, you now can bet on the games, depending on what country you're from. So if you go to ESP.bet, you can bet on games right now at the major. When they reveal the quarterfinals matchups, you'll be able to bet who you think are going to win. They'll have the odds on there, and you can win if you are indeed good enough. So let's see if you actually are going to put your money where your mouth is. Now, the Swiss system is something which was massively lauded when it first came into Counter-Strike. It was first used for the ESL1 Cologne 2016 qualifier. And then from the E-League Major onwards, we've had it as the actual initial phase, what used to be the group stage of the majors. And at numerous big tournaments, we've now had them. Obviously, we had it also at ESL1 Cologne, the main tournament this year. And so it's a system which we've had a chance to really see play out, and we've got to see the good aspects and we've got to see the bad aspects. And initially people were really hyped up on it. They really praised it because they found it very different to GSL system, and people thought, right, I got to play more matches than I usually do in GSL system against more opponents, and I never know which opponent I'm getting, so it feels more exciting as a format. But you'll notice a lot of pros, even top pros who are making the playoffs and making it deep in tournaments with Swiss system, are now coming out and saying they're not a big fan of it. They don't like it, and they actually want it to be changed and removed. Now, there are a lot of problems with it, but there are some solutions that adjust to the Swiss system, which will improve the Swiss system massively and take out basically the major problems that currently exist. So while I agree you can change format, like I have a few formats I'd rather change back to. Everyone knows I've been a big fan of the GSL system forever, but let's just talk about Swiss system for now. So the big problems that we have with Swiss system, the first one, the most obvious one that you see, is after the Swiss system plays out, you look back at the teams that were very good that didn't make it to the playoffs and the teams that surprisingly made it, and you often find this correlation that there are teams that had a very, very difficult path to get the 3 wins that you need to get out of the Swiss system, and therefore sometimes don't make it, but were very good teams, and if they were playing just killer teams at the time, and you're like, well, no surprise they didn't make it out. Then you'll always find, nearly always, there'll be one team who'll make the playoffs, and you think, wow, that's surprising, they finished top 8, but then you go and look, and they had a really easy path to their 3 wins. The 3 opponents that they got to get their wins off, like, you know, a couple of them might have been some of the objectively worst teams in the tournament, and then they only played maybe one decent team, and even that one might have been lucky with the redraw. So this year's ESL Cologne, I think we had 2 pretty obvious examples of this. So the most egregious one for me would be Team Liquid actually getting to the playoffs of this tournament. Okay, Team Liquid, team on the rise, the borderline top 10 team. They've had some good performances, some map wins over top teams in tournaments. You're thinking, hey, that's not unreasonable, right? Until you realise their 3 wins to get to the playoffs were against Na'Vi, like a bottom half top 10 team, Immortals, at that time probably barely a top 10 team, maybe a borderline top 10 team, and then Optic, who at the time, realistically, weren't a top 10 team. It'd been a while since they'd legitimately had any decent placings. They beat those 3 teams to make top 8 at the tournament. Meanwhile, Mouse Sports didn't make top 8 at the tournament, but they played Fnatic and FaZe and beat them. Fnatic, like borderline top 10 team. In fact, at ESL1 Cologne, when you consider they'd had a decent run at DreamHack, some people might have had them 10th or something in the world. FaZe, undisputably first or second best team in the world. So they beat both those teams, and then they lost by playing NIP. Admittedly, yes, not a ranked team at all. This was their first big comeback, so that one doesn't matter. But they played the same Na'Vi that Team Liquid did, lost to them. A team who's borderline top 10. And Cloud9, who just come top 4 at ECS the tournament before. And so if you were using up-to-date seeding, remember, my seeding isn't always up-to-date because I don't do it after every tournament. I do it like once a month. But if you did it between tournaments, Cloud9 would almost certainly be a top 10 team. So in that scenario, a team like Mouse Sports had a way tougher route to get there, and actually very impressive even in not getting there. Meanwhile, Team Liquid, like, yeah, they did all right, but they didn't even have that crazy performance because they didn't play that many great teams to get to the playoffs. Now, you could find much better examples from past Swiss systems, but I purposely chose ESL1 Cologne because I figured we should use either this major right now or ESL1 Cologne because they're in everyone's mind, so everyone knows roughly whereabouts those teams were seeded and how good those teams should or would have been. Whereas if I go back to an example last year, people aren't going to remember. They're going to see the name and think that like a certain team's amazing now, but who weren't that great back then in the context. So I also didn't use this major because I'm largely arguing just because of what's happened at this major. Now, I will say that the upsets that are happening at these tournaments that lead to those really weird matchups are not just due to upsets alone, as in they're not just due to good play from underdogs, which is the main point we want to stress here. It's not that we don't ever want underdogs to be allowed to win games. That is not the point whatsoever here. If an underdog wins a game, congrats. The point is that them winning a game shouldn't ridiculously skew based on random elements the rest of the tournament to then throw every other match off and lead to these fairly pretty much unfair situations for other people, positively or negatively. Although, with that said, I'm personally not a fan of underdogs winning because of what happens in this type of a system, as I explained in a video recently. Likewise, it's also not a problem that we're playing best of ones. I'm also not saying that you can't have best of ones. That's why in the title, it says Swiss Systems needs reseeding, best of 3, or both. Like, it can just be reseeding. Reseeding would take care of some of these problems I'm outlining. Because another problem is not just best of ones. Because yes, best of 1 promotes and creates more upsets than best of 3. Because you only have to win 1 map rather than 2 out of 3. So that's obviously more difficult to win 2 out of 3 than just 1. But that only plays a small factor in the big issues in Swiss system. The biggest issues are that when you play best of 1, we only have 1 veto system that we currently use for best of 1, which involves both teams vetoing 3 maps. The problem with vetoing 3 maps is that it means that you go oftentimes in matchups, even between very big favourites and very big underdogs, to the middle of the map pool, and you find a map that's playable for both teams. Now, that means that lesser teams in the tournament can escape, in theory, if they want to, from ever having to play their first, second, and third worst maps in their 7-map pool. So they can always get to worst case scenario, well, 1 in worst case scenario, their 4th best map, which is in the middle of the map pool. If they really wanted, they can escape all those other ones. Now, if this was a best of 3, remember the best of 3 veto system is you ban 1 map each, then you pick 1 match each. So in that scenario, they would have to play their first or second worst maps out of the 7 maps against some of the top teams that can pick that map. Even if they don't pick that map, probably their second or third worst map they're going to have to play. So you can see that it already gets much tougher, not just because you have to win 2 out of 3 maps in a best of 3, but because you also have to play some of your weaker maps against the opponent, and therefore he has much bigger chances of getting his map, and then also having a good chance to beat you on that 3rd map when he can then veto another of your strong maps. So you get some of your strong maps taken out, and you get your weak maps still have to be played. Now, lack of reseeding is also a massive factor in these tournaments. Like, beyond the veto system, I'm not that big a fan of. You still have to win that map. It's the reseeding that is the killer for me, because this is what's creating these really unfair matchups, where 2 people go 1-0, but then 2 of the lesser teams that did it draw each other, and then one of them gets a free 2-0 almost, whereas 2 very strong teams draw each other, and then you get a lesser one. So, in a world that we currently have of no reseeding, it is random as to who each pool plays. So everyone who wins the first match and is in the 1-0 pool, it's random as to who they play next. Everyone who goes 0-1, it's random as to who they play next. So the 2 worst teams to go 1-0 can both play each other. That's the problem, right? So let's imagine I give you a specific case right now to make that case for you without it being abstract, like the best and the second worst. Imagine a 1-0 group where we only have 4 teams. I realise that wouldn't happen because we have we'd have 8 teams be 1-0, but we're going to do it for the case of this to make it very simple and easy to understand. I'm going to make it as extreme as you can. Imagine in the 1-0 group, you had SK Gaming, #1 team in the world. You had FaZe, #2 team in the world. You had Flipside, not even top 10 ranked, one of the worst teams in the tournament. And you had Vega Squadron, on most people would agree, the worst team in the whole tournament. These 4 teams go 1-0. Now, in the current world we have, it's random. So actually, the 2 worst teams, by far the 2 worst of these 4, Flipside and Vega, can actually draw each other and play each other. And the winner of that game is going to be 2-0. Meanwhile, SK and FaZe, the 2 best teams in the world and in this pool, can draw each other, play each other, and one of them has to be 1-1. Only one of them can be 2-0. Why is it reasonable that Flipside and Vega can be 2-0 there? There's no real reason I can think of that would make that a reasonable draw. So, likewise, when you go to 0-1. So in 0-1, you can have a couple of good teams go down there, and they can both draw each other, and one of them is going to be 0-2. Meanwhile, because it's 0-1, you can have the 2 worst teams in the tournament go 0-1, but draw each other, and then one of them is going to be 1-1. Can you see how, in that lower group, it's actually quite unfair that one of the worst teams is going to get one of the 3 wins you need to get out of the group? Meanwhile, in the 1-0 group, 2 of the best teams in the world, only one of them can go 2-0 in the 1-0 group because they have to play each other, the 2 best teams in the world. So let's talk about solutions to the Swiss system. Now, first of all, I'm going to make this video about solutions to Swiss system because I do think it can be redeemed. I don't think you have to just throw it out the window and say, it doesn't work, it's got these problems, because these problems aren't inherent to the Swiss system. This is the Swiss system with extra context of what factors we've set the Swiss system up with. You don't have to have a Swiss system that has these problems if you implement what I'm about to talk about. But I will just make as a side point, because I want people to be aware of this, that there are lots of solutions to how we do the initial phase of tournaments. Like, you go back and you look, there are many options we have never even tried. Like, for example, a past international tournament in Dota, TI3, the one that Alliance won, was one where they tried a group system, which was 2 groups of 8 teams. And then, obviously, you see the 8 teams, but the whole point of the group stage wasn't to eliminate any teams. Where you finished in the group stage affected your seeding and where you played in the rest of the playoffs. So you played out the 2 groups of 8, and no one went out of the tournament. The top 4 teams in each group, so 8 teams overall, went to be the 8 teams in the upper bracket of a double elimination bracket. The bottom 4 teams in each group, so the bottom 8 teams, went into the lower bracket of the double elimination bracket, and then you played out a double elimination bracket. Now, you're going to already say, if you understand how long that would take, oh, well, come on, that's unreasonable. Like, that would take way too long to run. We don't have that much time in Counter-Strike. How about this? That tournament took 10 days to run over a group stage and a playoffs combined. The entire tournament, a double elimination tournament, and a group stage in which no one was eliminated, took 10 days. This PGL Krakow major will take 8 days to run. You only need 2 more days to run a system like that, where you get a lot more play out of it. You get to play 7 opponents, and then you get to play a minimum of 1 best of 3 in a playoff. And if you're in the upper bracket and the lower bracket, you have the error correcting elements there, and you have seeding from the group. You have all these factors that are good, and it only takes 2 more days. You're not breaking the bank. You're not ruining yourself. It's not double the time or a third of the time more or whatever. Actually, I guess it is a third of the time more. It's not going to take twice as much time or whatever. Yeah, that's kind of what I said already. So if you go and you look, another option obviously is the old GSL system. But people might say, but there were problems with GSL system. The obvious shift to GSL system is, if you want exactly how many matches there are now, just make the 2 best of 3 series the winners match and the decider match, so that the guys who are actually making the playoffs come from best of 3s. Yes, that means you're going to have 2 0-1 teams, but they're the losers. Who gives a fuck? I don't really care if the losing team loses 2 maps and goes out, as opposed to at Swiss where they lose 3 teams and go out. That's not really something I care about. With that said, you could also make it all best of 3, and again, add a couple of days to the tournament and run it like that. Also, adding all the matches to be best of 3 wouldn't be that many more games, by the way, than we have in Swiss system, which has to be like 33 games. Because the old system, without the best of 3s, was already less games. It's like, I think you could have like 25 or something. So, well, 26 or whatever. Now let's go and look, though, at Swiss, because I want to talk specifically about Swiss. So first and foremost, one way you could fix Swiss is to have best of 3. Now, Dota already did this. At the Kiev Major, they had a Swiss system, just like we have in CSGO, but they had it be best of 3 instead of best of 1. So that when you play those matches, that already makes each match less likely to have an upset, because it's a best of 3 and not a best of 1. And with it being a best of 3, secondary factor, in CSGO particularly, that's even better, because the map veto system changes. In Dota, that's different from that. They have the same hero bans each time, every time. But in CSGO, you would also have less upsets, because you wouldn't always meet in the middle of the map pool, because it's not a best of 1. It's a best of 3, which has the better map veto system. Now, I will say, at the current paradigm, it's unlikely to happen because logistically it requires more time, or it requires that some games be shown on other streams. Now, I think that's a good option. Have 2 streams running, have community casters on one that are at home, have the others at the event if you don't want to spend more money, but play 2 sets of games at once. That's a solution to it, to have a better format. Yeah, you won't watch every game in the tournament live, but you'll get a better tournament as a result of it. As I said, it also solves the problem of the vetoes. It gets rid of some of those upsets that happen just due to best of 1 and just due to the veto system. And finally, and this is a good reason, just as you see a lot of players and top teams complain now because they know that they can go out, and teams that they appreciate can go out in the system we currently have. If it's best of 3s, even though this doesn't take care of the reseeding aspects, which are still very, very tough and would still ruin some tournaments in my opinion, at least if you lose best of 3s each time, you yourself aren't going to complain as much. When you get a borderline draw where it's like, that is tougher than I probably should have gotten, but you know, I should on paper have beaten that team. If you then lose a best of 3 to that team, it's hard to complain, right? They did beat you 2 out of 3 maps. And you're going to have to kind of just have to tip your hat and say you were better than me in that match. You win. Likewise, if underdogs do get all those upsets and they really get to the playoffs, even though the reseeding aspect I still think is critical, I would have a lot more respect for those teams. Like if Gambit and Big had both won best of 3 series against every opponent, I'd be like, who the fuck can complain about this? I mean, the big one you can't really complain about anyway because they played 3 of the top 5 teams in the world. But the Gambit one, yeah, they didn't get the craziest opponents. But if they'd have won best of 3s against those opponents, I would still have some qualms, but I'd have a lot less. I'd say, hey, you fucking beat them in best of 3s though. That's legit. Now, reseeding, in my opinion, is the best way to fix Swiss system. I've told you already why I don't really like best of 1s, because of the map veto system and because of the fact that it is a best of 1. But just reseeding alone would fix a lot of the issues of the path that people get. Because reseeding provides a fantastic system. Because at the moment, the lack of seeding is what kills these Swiss system tournaments. Now, first of all, in Majors, it's even worse. Because in Majors, we can't even use real seeding for the first round. We have to use Valve seeding, where the contender teams have to be the higher seed, the Legends teams have to be the highest seeds, and the Challengers have to be the lower seeds. It doesn't matter if G2 is in the Challengers, and they are clearly a top 4 team in the world. And it doesn't matter that a team like Fnatic is in the Legends spot and therefore gets a top 8 seed, whereas no one in the world really would probably have them be top 8 if you had to rank for this tournament. So that in itself is a problem anyway. You don't have true seeding. But it means that you get matches like we saw in the qualifier. In the major qualifier, we had a first round matchup of G2 versus Immortals. Unreasonable matchup there, in a world where Mousesports played Tengri, one of the worst teams, if not the worst team in the tournament, and Godsent played Dignitas, 2 teams who were neither of which are top 10. So those matches all happened at the same time. Unreasonable. Secondly, the reason why we need reseeding is not just for the first matches, we need them properly seeded, but we need the second, and third, and fourth, and fifth rounds properly seeded. So, if we win, let's imagine this scenario. We're both different teams in the tournament. I'm the 9th best team in the world, and you're the 4th best team in the world. We both win our first matchup. And in the next round, I get a draw where I managed to draw the 13th best team in the world. I'm the 9th best team, and I've just drawn the 13th best team. You're the 4th best, but you've drawn the 8th best team in the world. How is that fair? Why is it fair that we both won a game, but you're now punished by a random element? And I get an easy match, and you get a hard match. We both did the same thing. Why is that fair? In the world that I'm suggesting of reseeding, that could never happen. I would always get a hard opponent. You would always get an easier opponent than me. Because I'm the 9th and the 16 in the tournament, and you're the 4th. So you have to get a team that's a lower team, and I have to get a team that's a higher team. That's fair. Now, as an example of that, do you remember at the E-League Major, a lot of people looked at Optic getting Astralis in the second round, and they said, oh, this is fucked up. They got Virtus Pro in the first round, which, by the way, if I'd seeded the tournament, again, would be impossible. And then they got Astralis in the second round. Now, at the time, those 3 teams, Optic, VP, and Astralis, were all top 5 teams in the world. So it should have been impossible for Optic to play those 2 teams in the first match and the 0-1 match. It should be impossible. It doesn't even matter that Astralis lost to Godsent, because Astralis would drop down, and if we reseed, right, well, in the 0-1s, actually, we would have had teams like Optic and Astralis as top seeds. Therefore, they could have never played in the second match. They would have played some of the worst teams in the 0-1, and therefore Optic would have had a much better chance to go 1-1. Now, that's a key point to make here. It can't happen a match like that with reseeding. Now, the point of the reseeding is, after each match, so we have the first match is okay, 8 teams go 1-0. What we do is, at the beginning of the tournament, before any match is played, we seed the teams 1-16. Now, before everyone says the same complaints every fucking time that you will not get the 1-16 perfect that everyone agrees upon. I have always made this point and no one has ever been able to argue against it. Let's say I did the seeding, or let's say you did the seeding. Here's the key part. It doesn't matter. Our seeding is better than no seeding, because no seeding means random, and random means everything can happen, and everything can happen means you can have the worst seeding possible. You can have, because it's random seeding, you can have SK be treated like the 16th best team in the world. You can have Tengri be treated like the best team in the qualifier, because every possibility is the outcome. Here's the difference. If I made the seeding, and for the major, I put SK number 1, worst case scenario, you might argue SK's number 2. I've only got them a little bit off, and in general, the tournament will play out as expected. In the major, I think Vega Squadron was the worst team at the major. Here's the difference. When you do your seeding, you are not going to, no matter who you are, who's a credible person, pick Vega Squadron in the top 8. So even if you're really biased and you pick them 10th, still, they can never be treated as the number 1 seed, but in a random system, they can be treated as the number 1 seed. And you would, even if you're incredibly biased and think, I only think SK is 3rd best, which would be quite unreasonable, they still can't be treated as the 16th best team. So seeding, and especially seeding by anyone credible, who's going to get some of them pretty close, is many, many times, 10, 100 times better than random seeding, which is what no seeding is. That's a key point to make. So let's say what we do in reseeding is we reseed before the tournament 1 to 16. So in this tournament, for example, as I've just said, the best team I think is SK and the worst team is Vega. So I would have SK plays Vega in the first round of the playoffs. Now, here's what happens. Let's say Vega Squadron manage an amazing upset. Remember, I've still got it as best of 1 in this system. They manage an incredible game where they beat SK Gaming and they go into the 1 and 0 bracket. Now, my number 2 seed would have been FaZe. And obviously, FaZe lost their opening match, right? But that's a different matchup because they didn't play the teams that we want here. So my second worst team at the major would probably have been either Flipside or Penta. So I think I would have gone for Flipside. So let's say FaZe had played Flipside in the opener and they'd lost to Flipside. Now Flipside's in the 1 and 0 bracket. Now in the current system, Flipside and Vega, the 2 worst seeds in the tournament, could draw each other and one of them could be 2 and 0. Now in my system, they could never draw each other because in this world, I have Astralis as the 3rd seeded team. And Astralis would very likely win their best game. Let's say they're playing Penta. Let's say Astralis wins. And so in the top 1 and 0 seeds, in my system, it would absolutely be Astralis playing against Vega in the first match of the 1 and 0 pool. Now if Vega wins that one as well, guess what? They're doing a fucking amazing job, and I have no complaints even about the best of 1s. They're earning these victories, and if they somehow manage to get to the playoffs, fantastic. Remember, they're only playing very, very tough teams, the best, because they're winning. So because they're winning, we're putting the best teams against the worst teams again and again by the seeding, and that's what we're deciding the tournament off. Now, if Vega drops down, and they go and play the 5th game, at that point in time, because of the seeding system being better, they can play a better team than them, sure, but they're not going to play the best team in the tournament because very likely the best team in the tournament's already through in the tournament because of how we done the seeding. That's the problem. The lack of reseeding is killing the draws. Now, you might say there are tournaments that in different sports that already do a system where if you win, you take that person's seed. Tennis is an obvious example. Well, there's an example of exactly what I'm talking about in sports itself, which is a few years ago, the NHL playoffs used to work how I'm talking about. Used to reseed. So, for example, in 2012, the LA Kings were the 8th seed in the Western Conference, and they beat the number 1 seed in the Western Conference and went to the 2nd round. Now, instead of taking the number 1 seed and therefore playing, like, you know, the number 4 seed or whoever it was who made it through, who was one of the lower seeds, they ended up playing in the next round against the 2nd best seed. And actually, throughout the whole playoffs, they ended up winning the Stanley Cup. They ended up playing the top seeds throughout the conference and won the cup. So guess what? No one could complain about seeding. No one could complain about playoffs formats. Everyone just had to say, fuck, you really beat all the best teams. You are the best team. Yeah, congrats. You really showed it and you had the toughest path, but you did it anyway. That's what I want to make the point here is. We're not saying we don't want upsets to ever happen. We want upsets to happen in a way where we're like, wow, you fucking, yeah. You earned it, absolutely. There was no bullshit. It wasn't because of veto, and it wasn't because of just a best of 1, and it wasn't because you got a lucky bracket. Take it all out. You actually upset and played better than a team that is much better than you ranked. So it actually makes upsets more epic. It makes them more impressive, and it reduces criticism of them. Now, everyone who says stuff like, oh, if you were good enough, then you'd have won the match anyway. That is circular logic. Like what you've done is you said, this system is good. Why? Because the teams that win in it are good, and since good teams win, that proves the system is good. That is purely circular logic. Not only does it mean nothing, but first of all, it's provably not the case, because as I've mentioned, we're not just talking about one best of 1, we're talking about the whole tournament, and you can get a much harder path, which makes it way less likely you'll win, or you can get a much easier path, which makes it way more likely you'd win. So it's not about if you're good enough, you'll win. It's more like if you get the right random seeding, you'll win. Well, how does that tell you anything good? If anything, that shows that the system's bad. Then you've got to consider that logic, if you were good enough then you'd have won, applies to any system that can exist. So if we make the tournament tomorrow so that it's a best of 1 with a pure randomizer as to what map you get, The same logic applies, right? By that logic, well, if you were good enough, you'd still win. Doesn't matter that the best map for the underdog could come out in your worst map. Yeah, if you were good enough, you could win. So that's justified that system. So let's get rid of Swiss system as we have it, and let's just have it be a randomizer with no vetoes, because by the same logic, that applies, right? It's circular logic. It doesn't make any sense. It means nothing. And then people say, but who cares who you had to play? If you want to get to the Legends spot or win the tournament, you got to beat all the best teams. Well, you don't. That's the whole point of what I'm pointing out with the path here. If you have a very hard path, it's much less likely you'll make it. If you have a very easy path, it is very likely you will make it. So that shows that actually you can make it to number 1 by playing all the easy teams and not playing any of the top teams. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? To say that you just have to beat all the best teams anyway. Well, now, finally, the reason why this sort of thing matters is not just because it promotes better matches to make it so that the best teams play a proper path through the tournament and the lower teams play a proper path through the tournament, but also because placings matter. Like, it matters who becomes a Legends spot. Top 8 is prestigious. Brackets end up being seeded on where people place and how they do in the tournament. It's important that we have good brackets so that we don't end up with a bracket like the ESL1 Cologne bracket, where the good teams were in the bottom half of the bracket, and then the top half of the bracket was, it was a bit shaky, right, compared to what it would have been. And FaZe probably was the second best team in the tournament, but never got to the final. So this is an example of why we need to do one or both. We've got to either do reseeding to get rid of the terrible paths. We've got to do best of 3 to get rid of the fact you meet in the middle of the map veto and therefore upsets are more likely in best of 1. Or let's do both. Let's do both at the same time and have an epic tournament that only takes a couple more days to do, but it means that any upsets are truly lauded and appreciated for being really epic and really amazing play by those teams. And in general, we don't have really good teams going out because they played a super tough route. And we don't have not so great teams getting through the playoffs in lucky fashion purely due to the die being rolled and them winning out on getting the lucky draw.
Welcome everybody. Blessed are those that visit this channel and enjoy the content here.
Hey guys, this is Stewie from Cloud9.